Before we begin our exploration of media regulation in Australia, there are two important points which in many ways lay the groundwork for everything that follows in our discussion. And the first point is that there are no formal laws regulating print media in this country. So that's based on principles and ideals of free speech and freedom of the press, even though Australia, unlike the United States, has no constitutional protection for freedom of speech. It is an unspoken or a given principle, if you like, that is used as the explanation for why there are no formal laws regulating print media in this country. Print media is regulated through the back door, if you like, by laws relating to cross-media and foreign ownership, which are part of the Broadcasting Services Act. So the Act of Parliament which regulates television and radio, obviously. So we're going to understand or get a sense of how print media is regulated via the Broadcasting Services Act in a moment. The second key point involving media regulation in Australia is that media regulation is or takes place through a process known as self-regulation, or it's a self-regulatory approach in the first instance. So media organizations initially are responsible for policing their own actions. So in other parts of this module, you'll see how a citizen, an audience member who has a complaint or wants to complain to a TV, radio station or internet service provider might go about things. And their first point of contact is the content producer itself. So the TV station, the radio station, or in the case of the internet, the company, the content creator who produced the content. So self-regulation begins with the media organization, and they are initially responsible for policing their own actions. Government representatives and government agencies only become involved if the issue cannot be resolved at that initial basic level. So that's how self-regulation works. It begins with people complaining, making submissions to media organizations themselves, and then the government only becomes involved at a later stage if those problems cannot be resolved at that initial level. Now, critics of this approach argue that self-regulation is a little bit like leaving Dracula in charge of the blood bank. Sometimes, in some respects, the idea that media organizations would be responsible for regulating themselves in the first instance, does really suggest a conflict of interest in some respects. So that's why the government does regulate this process, or monitor this process at least, at later stages. So media regulation in Australia is governed by these two, or is sort of overseen or influenced by these two important points. No formal laws for the regulation of print media in Australia. And secondly, media regulation is largely a process of self-regulation from the media industries themselves. The important question that I want us to think about in our discussions of media regulation and how that operates in Australia is the basic question of why we should regulate, why we should have laws and policies regulating the media in the first place. And I want to take us through some of these principles, and they're things that you will discuss in your workshop. There's certainly principles that you want to keep in mind in your workshop activities. The case study that you're going to work on, which looks at the merger between the Nine Network and Fairfax Media. These are principles that you want to come back to, and we will indeed come back to time and time again over the course of this module. And the key principle underpinning why we should regulate the media, or why the media needs to be regulated, is that it is not just another business. So in our first discussion of the media last week, we explored why the media is important, and we spoke about broadly its ability to influence and impact on the way we as audiences think and feel and behave. Now that gives the media, any branch of the media, whether we're talking about journalism, advertising, public relations, documentary makers, entertainment producers, more broadly, it gives the media incredible power. So we need protection as citizens, as audiences, because the media is not just another business. And underpinning that is the requirement for media organizations to balance their free market and public service roles. So commercial media obviously exists to make a profit, but even commercial media has public service functions. Now, regardless of how we think of its quality, commercial media, commercial television stations like 7, 9 and 10 all have news and current affairs, for example. Even though a newspaper like the Courier Mail or the Sydney Morning Herald exists to make a profit, it still has notions of public service, all those characteristics of liberal media that we spoke about last week. It still has those as underlying principles. So that's another reason why media regulation is important, because it's valuable, indeed essential, for audiences that media organizations balance their profit-making and their public service roles. The notion of influence is another very important reason why the media needs to be regulated, why we need laws and policies that control, if you like, the media. So again, this comes back to the idea that the media has the ability to influence public opinion. Too much influence is seen as potentially being very damaging for democracy. Too much influence damages democracy. And that flows into the principle of diversity of opinion. We're going to see in this module that Australia has a very concentrated, a very highly concentrated system of media ownership. So in other words, the media organisations in Australia are owned by a comparatively small number of people, in particular Rupert Murdoch and News Corporation. Now, diversity of opinion is seen as the cornerstone of a healthy democracy. So the more people, or the more companies, the more organisations that produce media, the better. That is seen as producing a diversity of opinion, a diversity of content that is valuable for a healthy democracy. So in Australia, we have laws that restrict the amount and the types of media that companies can own. That diversity, or that idea of diversity, also carries over into the diversity of our population and where our population lives. So Australia is a large, sparsely populated country. When we're talking about regional and remote areas, it's costly, it's expensive to produce the infrastructure or to create the infrastructure that allows people in remote areas to get media, whether that be television, radio, or internet services. It's an unfortunate fact that it costs more to have a mobile phone in regional and remote Australia than it does in metropolitan areas. It costs more to have access to the internet in regional and remote Australia than it does in metropolitan Australia. So that idea of the inequality between access to services based on where people live is a real issue for a large country such as Australia. So media regulation and laws allow a relatively equitable level of access to information and entertainment across the country. Media regulation, and I'm talking about the Racial Vilification Act, I'm talking about laws relating to defamation, are absolutely essential to balancing freedom of expression against abuses of that freedom. So we have laws in Australia, and we're going to be talking about these in a few weeks, that prevent the vilification of people based on race, gender, religion, cultural identity. Those laws exist to protect us against the abuses of freedom of expression. Related to that idea of balancing freedom of expression, artistic expression, political expression against the abuse of that power is the notion of content classification. So if you go to the movies, if you watch a DVD, if you play video games, and also, of course, if you watch television, you will know that there are content classifications which recommend the type of audience that this content is suitable for. So we have C classification, which indicates that the content is produced specifically for children, all the way through to 18 plus for adult content. Now, content classification exists to allow people, most commonly parents, to make decisions, to make informed decisions about what content is suitable for their children to watch, or for adults to make informed decisions about, you know, what content is suitable they want to watch. So if an adult doesn't like, you know, particularly violent or sexually explicit content, there is a classification guide there which will inform them that hey, this may not be the content that is for you. Media regulation also protects Australia against cultural imperialism. So we're going to have a look in more detail at Australian content laws, which mandate that commercial television stations and the ABC and SBS are required to screen a certain amount of Australian produced content. Similar laws exist for pay TV streaming services, We think that will eventually happen, but at this point, that's a bit of a grey area. But these laws, which ensure that our major television networks screen Australian content, helps promote national identity and reflect Australia's cultural diversity. And they also provide financial support for content production industries. So the Australian television and film industry, or the screen production industry, and we're factoring in streaming services and services like Netflix, Stan, and YouTube here. Makers of content for those platforms also can receive financial support. And that's because the Australian media industry, compared to obviously the United States, but we're also talking about other really significant media markets such as the UK, such as India, and also Asia, would simply be swamped by that content because it is cheaper to import content than it is to produce it locally. And of course, now those barriers around national borders have broken down thanks to digital media and the ease with which content can flow across national borders. That notion of needing to protect our local industries and protect our local content makers is even more important. And these are really important regulations because they're going to help you if you move into the content production industry, which I'm assuming that many of you are going to want to do. Regulation in terms of privacy and consumer protection laws. So the agreements that you're supposed to read and tick the box to consent to when you sign up to a platform that actually warn you how much information you're giving away and what the app or the platform will do with it. Merger laws. So in the same way that, we might be concerned when Nine and Fairfax merge, should we be concerned when when Facebook buys Instagram, or when Microsoft buys LinkedIn and lynda.com, the online learning platform? Another key issue that was explored by the ACCC that relates to regulating the internet is the use of algorithms. So those pieces of code which influence the content that we get on our social media feeds. So there's a fundamental difference here between information Facebook wants you to like versus the information that you kind of need or are entitled to in order to function as a knowledgeable citizen.